The US public debt is at the all-time high, $35 trillion. It's $100,000 for each American. Central banks around the world are dumping the US treasuries. They are replacing the toxic bonds by the timeless gold. Here's the thing, the US will not pay off its debt. Hi, my name is Vitaly. I am an economist. I am a boring mainstream economist. Watch this video if you want to learn about the US public debt, how big it is, why the US will keep raising its debt for as long as possible, and why this madness is about to end. The US public debt is unlike any other economic indicator because it's exact, it's a precise number. Other economic indicators allow for mistakes, miscalculations, manipulations, and outright lies. For example, the Biden administration has always been revising the old data for the worse. When they first present economic data on GDP or inflation or unemployment, they present a picture that is too optimistic, too rosy, too wonderful. Then they wait one quarter and they revise the old data. They tell you that GDP was less and inflation was more than we officially reported. But by this moment, 9 months passed. And nobody cares about such an old data. So when the Biden administration revised the old data, nobody cares. It's quite a smart strategy to lie first and to correct your lie later. But the US public debt is not like that. It's a precise number. The US owes 35 trillion, period. $35 trillion. How much is it? If you live in the United States, imagine that you owe $1,500,000. But you do. You owe $1,500,000 because that's a debt per person. And that number is on top of the taxes you're already paying. Speaking of taxpayers, if you're a US taxpayer, you owe $2 and $10, $100,000. If you take the American public debt, $35 trillion, and break it into $100 banknotes and stack them one by one, you can make it all the way to the moon and back 70 times. The US public debt is astronomical. The American public debt goes up by 1 trillion every 100 days. The Biden administration promises to reduce the budget deficit by 3 trillion over the next 10 years. He's not going to be the president, but he's going to reduce the budget deficit by magic.
Whatever he proposes is dead on arrival.
The interest payments on the US public debt hit $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year, that's roughly the GDP of the state of Illinois. Imagine if everything the state of Illinois produces goes to serve public debt. Not to reduce it, no, just to serve public debt, just to send interest payments to Japan, China and other bondholders. Now, for how long can the US keep raising its debt? For how long can the US keep borrowing and spending beyond their means? A simple answer is for as long as possible. If other countries are willing to keep buying US bonds and keep giving Americans money, why not keep doing it? So the US will keep raising its debt for as long as possible. But how long is possible? When will be that moment when enough is enough? Let's look at the debt to GDP ratio. For the United States, it's 125%. And it's not the biggest in the world. So the US can raise its debt to at least these levels, to the levels of Sudan and Greece and Lebanon and Japan. If Japan was allowed to raise its debt this much, why not the US? And let's put aside the fact that the astronomical public debt of Japan triggered a severe recession, a depression for at least 30 years. Let's put this uncomfortable fact aside and state that the US can and will raise its debt to the level of Japan. But here is a second prediction, that the US will keep raising its debt forever, indefinitely, until the second coming of Jesus. If right now the US debt goes up by 1 trillion every 100 days, why not every day? 1 day passed, 1 trillion out the window. But seriously, the US can, in theory, raise its debt indefinitely for one simple reason. The US dollar is a reserve currency. Reserve currency is the currency used by most governments and central banks around the world for investments and transactions. The US dollar can buy anything, anywhere in the world. And the United States can just print US dollars. They can create dollars out of thin air. And that is why America keeps spending, borrowing, and raising its debt. And that is coming to an end. The world dominance of the US dollar is coming to an end. Just a few years ago, let's say 10 years ago, the US dollar was almost the only currency in international transactions. More and more countries are using their own currencies for transactions, most of all China and Saudi Arabia. Over the past 10 years, the US government has been imposing many sanctions on many countries, declaring this country an enemy or that country an enemy, and the list of enemies keeps going up. Why does America have so many enemies? Anyway, every time the US government freezes assets and imposes sanctions, it shows that the US dollar is toxic. That assets nominated in US dollars can be frozen, taken away like that. That the US can freeze assets because of the politics of the day, and the US politics is so unpredictable. Which means that every self-respecting country should get rid of US dollars. And that is already happening. Many countries are selling off the US debt. They are dumping US bonds. China, Russia, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia are selling US bonds as fast as possible. In the first quarter of this year, China sold 53 billion worth of the US public debt, the all-time high. And that is why the US was hit by high inflation. Most experts, including myself, were saying that high inflation happened because the US government spent too much. Which is true, but it was also true for any US government. The US governments under Trump, Obama or Bush were spending as much as possible, and yet inflation was low, barely 2% a year. Why? Because when the US government was printing US dollars, those dollars were spread around the world, and other countries were taking that inflationary pressure on themselves. Not anymore. Now, those US dollars are going back to the US. They are staying in the US, triggering a high inflation in the United States. Now, when the American government spends money, it's an American problem. If China, the second biggest holder of the US debt, stops buying US bonds, stops lending to the US, who will? Who will replace China, the second biggest economy in the world, as the biggest lender of the US? Japan? But Japan can only do this much, and Japan has been in a recession, depression for many decades by now. Europe is going down. Europe is falling apart. There is no substitute for China. You probably want to say, no way, there is no way the US dollar will lose its power. And I agree, right now, today, the US dollar is the most respected and much desired currency. But first, things change. And second, can you guess which asset is ready to replace the US dollar? Gold. And that is already happening. Central banks around the world are already replacing their reserves in dollars by reserves in gold. And they do it not because they don't like the United States, but because having gold or other currencies now is a matter of survival. Central banks will keep replacing the toxic dollars by the timeless gold. And this process will be slow, little by little, step by step. Things will change gradually and then suddenly. One day you will wake up and the world has changed. Now, let me tell you the most shocking thing. The US is not going to pay off its debt. Again, slowly. The US is not going to pay off its debt. It will cheat, but don't take it from me. Take it from the former President Donald Trump.
Who knows, maybe we'll pay off our $35 trillion, hand him a little crypto check, right? We'll hand him a little Bitcoin and wipe out our $35 trillion.
But how do you...
Here, President Donald Trump is very honest. He's not even hiding the fact that the US will not pay off its debt. Instead, it will write a fake check in a made-up currency. The US debt will disappear. A big cheat is coming. And of course, that will mean the end of the US dollar, the end of the US economic power, and the end of the world as we know it. I am going to explain this idea in detail later in my next videos. So thank you for watching, thank you for your interest in economics, and I'll talk to you next time.